I started this work when I was a PhD student. I joined as a PhD student in the Max Planck Institute for Innovation and Competition back in 2009. And at that time, I was totally obsessed with intellectual property laws. And I was looking for means of incentivizing exactly what the title says, conservation, research, and innovation with agrobiodiversity. But interestingly, my preoccupation at that time and also now was not only linked to incentivizing the conservation of biodiversity for its own sake, although there's enough reason to do that as well. My interest derived from this particular, sorry, I skipped too many slides, this particular individual. His name is Babaji Ramji Kobragari, and he's a small farmer. He had actually about 2 acres of land in which he was cultivating rice that was also being cultivated by other farmers of the region. And in 1983, while harvesting his crop, he discovered a very unusual grain or type of rice on his farm. And he's saved those seeds and recultivated them slowly and found that they actually give higher yield and are not so dependent on fertilizer and pesticides as the other varieties he was cultivating. So he named that variety HMT, which was actually named after a popular watch brand in India at that time. So he didn't know what else to name it, so he just called it HMT when he went to the market to sell it. And this rice became very, very rapidly the most popularly cultivated rice variety in his region in South India. And in 1994, when the rice had really spread like wildfire also outside of his state, the local university came and collected a sample from him, of course, for free, and went on to purify the variety on their fields and received a plant variety protection certification for it. And from that certification, although they made a huge profit, Kobragari didn't see a single rupee from it. A few years ago, Kobragari died in abject poverty, and he is reported to not even have had the money to pay for his own medications. So this story actually moved me, and there are many, many such stories in India, which I will not go to in too much detail because of time. But we have here, for example, I'm sorry, my computer seems to be going crazy. Just a moment. We have here the Kani tribals, who cultivate a traditional variety of leaves called agrobiodiversity, which has medicinal properties, and it was patented in the form of a sports supplement. It became a very huge success, but again, the tribals got little to no benefit from the work that they were doing and their traditional knowledge about what are the medicinal properties of this leaf. Similarly, we have the story of Sona Moti, which is a 5,000-year-old Emma variety. It was being cultivated in different localities in India, and it was found by research to have the highest quantity of folic acid that any grain in the world contains. And yet the farmers were hardly able to get any money from their sales until in 2019, a local NGO rediscovered it and gave it a concrete name, Sona Moti, and promoted its nutritional properties. So these were just some of the stories of agrobiodiversity, which really motivated me to think about how can we incentivize the conservation of biodiversity and also incentivize research and innovation with it by the farmers themselves, as well as by research institutions. So just as a side note, the whole story goes beyond India, because if you see the new EU organic regulations that came out in 2018, they actually say in a recital that agrobiodiversity contained in so-called heterogeneous seeds are more disease resistant, they are more environmental stress resistant, and as we saw in the case of both Arogya Pacha and Sona Moti, they also can have higher nutritional value. So what is it that is causing the loss of biodiversity? The research identifies three reasons, or these three are well-known reasons for the depletion of biodiversity. According to UN estimates, since the expansion of commercial farming in the 20th century, about 75% of the agrobiodiversity has been lost, particularly because of the use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides and corresponding improved seeds, but also because seed laws in Europe outlaw in some countries agriculture with heterogeneous seeds or indigenous seeds for the purpose of food security. So here we see that farmers, especially in countries like Europe, of course, may be motivated or required by law to stop cultivating indigenous varieties. But my question was that why are farmers also in India and other developing countries where cultivation with indigenous seeds is not outlawed, why are they still cultivating with biodiversity? And what my PhD thesis discovered was that perhaps one of the reasons is kind of a market failure, where the farmers are selecting improved varieties because they are aiming for short-term profits rather than for long-term conservation of their lands and even long-term protection of their own incomes. So following the simple definition of market failure, the individual pursuit of one's own self-interest instead of promoting the interest of society as a whole can make society worse off. But this didn't answer for me the question of why in parallel there was a huge movement, and there is now even now a growing movement towards organic farming, and particularly towards what in India is known as natural farming, which is a kind of agroecology. So in 2018-19, we received funding from the UK government to investigate what is it that's preventing farmers from conserving agrobiodiversity, and what are the problems being faced by those who are engaged with natural farming and agrobiodiversity conservation, particularly vis-a-vis market and profits. So we found that the natural farmers were facing several issues. The first one was that because there was no intellectual property protection for their varieties, for their seeds, they found there to be inadequate attribution and recognition for their innovative work with seeds. Second, and linked to the first one, there were suboptimal economic and other incentives for them to continue that work in a profitable way. Third, farmers shared with us that once they would share their seeds with either other farmers or what happened with the HMT rice with research institutions, there was no traceability. Nobody could prove what the source of those transformed or improved seeds were. So there was no traceability. Also, as we saw in the case of the Sona Moti wheat with folic acid, there was suboptimal research and education about the benefits, including nutritional benefits and other benefits linked with the cultivation with agrobiodiversity. Also, therefore, there were lack of reliable communication channels and also a lack of marketing channels for these types of seeds and also the produce reducing from it. Also, at a very practical level, for farmers who were cultivating with these seeds, there was no method of documenting or verifying the quality of their seeds to create a concrete market and a regular market for their seeds. And we had also suboptimal knowledge creation and verification. And this is something we're seeing also in Europe, that farmers who want to go into organic farming, they, even after they join, sometimes they go back to conventional because there is just not enough knowledge about how to successfully continue with sustainable agricultural methods. Further, because there was a lack of marketing channels and a lack of methods of verifying quality, there was also no means of ensuring timely availability and affordability of these seeds. And finally, because indigenous seeds or heterogeneous seeds often do not grow in the presence of fertilizer-rich or pesticide-rich soils, there was a lack of knowledge about traditional ecological knowledge or traditional knowledge-based farming systems in which these seeds are found to thrive and perform the best. So beyond these market-related failures, what we started looking at was also at the international level, what's going on at the regulations standpoint. And here is where we came across several regulatory failures that are leading to suboptimal incentives for conservation, research, and innovation with agrobiodiversity. So regulatory failure, as most of you probably know, is a situation where government intervention leads to inefficient allocation of resources, or if we want to use the language of the Convention of Biodiversity, regulations actually provide perverse incentives that work against incentivizing biodiversity conservation. So what are some of these regulations that I'm talking about? So we see, for example, if you look at intellectual property laws, for formal innovations, and by formal innovations, I mean innovations that are coming from, say, the research laboratories or from formal corporations and international agencies. These innovations have specific characteristics. They are homogeneous seeds. That means they are novel, uniform, and stable. And these are the basic criteria needed to get a plant breeder's right or a patent over these varieties. And this then converts into monetary incentives. But when we talk about informal innovations, we don't have the same novelty, uniformity, or stability. By definition, heterogeneous seeds are not uniform or stable. As a result, they cannot meet the criteria for plant breeders' rights or for patents, and there are therefore, under intellectual property rights, no incentives. So we see a kind of an inequitable incentive structure within intellectual property systems. Further, we see in international biodiversity regimes, we see that there is currently a lack of traceability of plant genetic resources exchanged. Despite there being a paper trail, there are many, many instances of what is called as biopiracy or black market transactions. Second, there are, of course, many administrative and bureaucratic hurdles, to the extent that I've spoken to researchers working with biodiversity who have said that if I want to follow the CBD or the seed treaties regulations to the T, it will probably take time until I've retired for me to access materials in a legal way. And there is also no rules currently in place for sharing digital sequence information. And therefore, the whole benefit sharing regime itself under these international laws is inherently weak. Further, as a result of these regulatory shortcomings, we see that under the Nagoya Protocol, on an average, only about 2 access and benefit sharing agreements per year per country have been signed. More clearly, under the seed treaty, from the more than 3.3 million samples that have been exchanged, there has been absolutely no instance of benefit sharing with farmers. So we saw that in order to level the landscape of incentives, we got a second funding from the UK government in 2019 to recommend what we called a 3-pronged approach to reinvigorate the incentives for sustainable seed innovations by especially the informal sector, the farmers. And that included, of course, revival of traditional ecological knowledge systems, redesigning educational curriculums, and re-leveling the incentives landscape through the adoption of technical solutions like blockchain. So after that very long introduction, which I found to be very important to set the base of why we are going to talk about blockchain in the first place, let me jump into the advantages of blockchain in terms of its technical features. So first of all, it's a trustless system. It permits traceability to source and therefore also transparency, and it has an additional possibility to add the feature of security. So as we saw in the seed sector, trustlessness is important because the current structures or current regulatory frameworks are not being able to create that trust. For example, linked to biopiracy. Second, there is automation, especially in the context of the execution of, say, benefit sharing agreements. The parties in the network can define rules that everyone has to adhere to, and we can build on smart contracts on top, so that if a certain requirement is fulfilled, the benefit sharing, including in terms of monetary benefits, can automatically flow to the people who have transferred the materials or know-how. Third, we have independence from third parties. That means unless we really want it, we don't really need to go through, say, a local government or a local NGO to get access to materials. And yet there is, as we said, a traceability. So the members of the network can choose to run the network amongst themselves without a single party being able to manipulate the whole system. And finally, we can build in incentive mechanisms. This is emerging research, especially from Roman Beck in the IT University of Denmark. He's doing a lot of work on how incentives can be built into blockchain systems to incentivize tasks that other systems of regulation are unable to do. So when can we say that a blockchain technology is particularly useful? So what are the use cases of blockchain? We see that blockchain technology is particularly good when we are talking about a system where transactions are centrally important. So whether it be transacting Bitcoin, or we are talking about transacting know-how or materials that are underlying specific heterogeneous materials, there are transactions. Second, we need in that system to have immutable record keeping. What is immutable record keeping? That we need a system where the source can be traced and nobody can erase any of the transaction histories. That's immutable record keeping. And as we just discussed, that is centrally relevant if we want fair, equitable benefit sharing to incentivize work with agrobiodiversity. And of course, to give concrete benefits to farmers. Third, there have to be multiple stakeholders. And definitely in the agrobiodiversity sector, we have a huge number of stakeholders. We have farmers, we have researchers, we have the corporate sectors, we have government agencies, including certification agencies such as organic certification agencies. We have consumers, and we have a plethora of other stakeholders. Then the system should benefit from checkposts. So for example, as we say, who is going to watch the watchdog? How do we, like in blockchain, they say, it's garbage in and garbage out. How can we have a system where we make sure that the know-how or the material details that are entered are actually accurate? So you need checkposts. And finally, you need a decentralized management and monitoring of the system as a whole. So these are some of the features of blockchain technology, which I found to be very attractive for complementing or supporting the existing international regulatory framework for the transfer of agrobiodiversity. So in agriculture, as we said, we need incentives for agrobiodiversity conservation. And as we saw in the previous slide, incentives can be built into blockchain. Second, we need some degree of digital identity. Now, it's very interesting for me that Europe, for instance, is talking about data portability. They want to create a data economy, which is based on both private, both personal and non-personal data. And data linked to agrobiodiversity is like a gold mine. So those who are holding this resource can be given a digital identity, which can still be kept secure, so that they can get benefit from sharing their know-how. Third, as we saw, the farmers are requesting a record of transactions. They want to make sure that once they transfer their materials to others, there's a record of that transaction, which is immutable. There should be a possibility to verify data, that whether the data that has been entered is of good quality, is it accurate, or is it made up? And finally, there is a need to remove intermediaries. So for example, if you see now the sales of Sona Moti, this wheat, Emma wheat, which is rich in folic acid, the NGOs have created direct marketing channels, because of which farmers are now for the first time able to get 10 times the rate they were earlier getting for selling their wheat. So here we see that the inequitable incentive structures that were created either due to market failures or regulatory failures in the form of challenges by farmers can be overcome to a large extent by blockchain. So for example, as we saw here, we used in an article recently, we categorize each of these challenges with ++ indicating how, indicating that blockchain can have a huge contribution, plus indicating that it can have a partial contribution, and 0 indicating that it has no contribution, while minus indicating that it can have a negative effect in the current system. So vis-a-vis the farmer challenges we identified, we saw that blockchain can support every one of the current challenges. Vis-a-vis other shortcomings, particularly linked to regulatory failures, we found that while blockchain can still help here, vis-a-vis especially traceability and access, and in terms of incentives for sharing digital sequence information or also the materials, things like political pressures and policy-based imperatives cannot be overcome by a blockchain-based solution. Also, there can be a fear, especially in the short run, that because of the changes in the power balances that currently exist, there can be a lot of retaliation at the grassroots level. Here is where the securing of the identity of farmers becomes very, very important. So if I was planning on ending my talk here for time purposes, but if there is still time, I can show you a dynamic model of what we developed as a pitch.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so let's see if I can skip through. So we conceptualized a network called Reseed, in which we thought that if we take 3 stakeholders to begin with, what kind of problems can a blockchain-based solution overcome? So taking the first stakeholder group, which is farmers. Farmers can be re-empowered. So for example, under the new EU organic regulations, we can actually create a digital marketplace for farmers to sell heterogeneous seeds, share their know-how, and therefore help other organic farmers forecast success. For the second stakeholder group, the researchers, who are all of us, a blockchain-based solution could promote access to data. Right now, we see that researchers find it very, very difficult to find even the locations where they will find new genetic resources. I've had researchers telling me in my interviews that they collect, say, genetic resources from a location in Africa or in Asia. And 10 years down the line, when they go back to the same location to collect updated local genetic material, all the farmers have already migrated to improved varieties. So that whole source of indigenous varieties or heterogeneous varieties is lost forever. So when there is such a distributed network for farmers to enter data, researchers can access the data, and they are able then also, with the help of, say, an add-on AI feature, to do targeted searching, and most importantly, legitimately and quickly source material and information. And finally, for the consumers, such a network can help in getting nutritional education. Think again about the wheat Sona Moti with folic acid, also to learn about local food varieties and to support current trends. So this is just a formulation of a possible network that can be created using blockchain. And we are now working with some minimum funding that we're receiving from an NGO in India that is promoting promoting agroecology, particularly natural farming, to build a prototype, which we hope to build in the coming year once we've done some basic research. So these are some papers. I would like to acknowledge Julia Koeninger, who was my research assistant for many years and is now a PhD student at the University of Vigo in Spain. She's done some excellent work with me on this research topic. Also Ulrich Kallersdorfer from the blockchain group in the Technical University, who helped really identify the pluses and minuses that we saw of where blockchain can or cannot help. And of course, Roman Beck from IT University of Copenhagen, who's a well-known name in blockchain economics. So that's about it, and I'm happy to take any questions.